Good evening. My name is Vivek Natarajan. I'm an associate professor of marketing, and I'm privileged to be serving as the president of Lamar University Senate for this academic year. Let me welcome you all to the Lamar University Distinguished Faculty Lecture, Flashpoints of Flight, the Enduring Rhetorical Legacy of 20th Century Women Aviators by Dr. Sara Hillin. The Distinguished Faculty Lecture is a tradition that began at Lamar University as a way to reward faculty who best represent the university ideal of seeking knowledge through critical inquiry. In order to become a distinguished faculty lecturer, a faculty member must best exemplify the idea of the scholar teacher. Not only capable of innovation and insight in research, but of making the critical stuff of being able to share their knowledge and enthusiasm with others. The award is chosen by a committee that is unique in that it represents every aspect of Lamar, including faculty from every college, students, administration, staff, and members of the Beaumont community. Since the first lecture given by Regents Professor Dr. John Story in 1987, the award has been one of the highest achievable honors granted to Lamar faculty. This award is made possible only through the support of ExxonMobil. And as you can see, there is a big, rich tradition of history to this award. So if you have been a former distinguished faculty lecturer and are in the audience, may I request you stand and be recognized. It's obvious to make this kind of an event happen. It takes a lot of effort, and as I told you in the background, this community is a very multidisciplinary, multi-background committee. So I want to thank the committee that made the selection of the lecturer and this event possible. Jennifer Ravi and her team from the last year put this event together, and it was very well, the baton was very well received by Dorothy Sisk and Mark Astoris, who would be running the committee next year. So if you have been a member of this committee or chairing this committee, may I ask that you please stand and be recognized. Thank you. At this moment, it's my privilege to welcome to the podium Dr. Kenneth Evans, the president of Lamar University.
Well, thank you, Vivek, and welcome. I'm glad to see such a great crowd out there tonight. Well, thank you for being part of this, and I'm looking forward, as you are, to hearing Dr. Sara Hillin's presentation this evening. She's an associate professor here in English at Lamar. I'd also like to personally recognize our sponsor for this distinguished faculty lecture series, ExxonMobil, and thank you, Ashley Alamiu, for being here this evening as a representative of ExxonMobil. We appreciate your support of the university. Some organizations have relationships with universities that last some period of time, but in the case of ExxonMobil, we're talking 3 decades. And over that period of time, they have supported a variety of programs, including this lecture series this evening, to the tune of about $4.75 million. Additionally, they have provided funds through contributions, match contributions of their employees to Lamar, which total now to date about $1.8 million. So as you can see, it's an incredibly generous relationship they have with us, and we hope it's reciprocal. We believe it is. They also provide support for the Bernard Harris Science Summer Camp on the LU campus, and they partnered in the Greater South Park Neighborhood Association, a very important commitment that our institution has engaged in over the past few years. So thank you, ExxonMobil, for all you do. We are greatly appreciative. Now it's my pleasure to welcome to the podium Dr. Catalina Castellón, Associate Professor of English and Modern Languages. But before she speaks, I want to remind you that at the end of the presentation, we have yet another brief presentation that we'd like to make to our speakers. So please stay seated, if you would, for a brief period of time after the presentation is over. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good evening, and welcome to Lamar University's 2017 Distinguished Faculty Lecture. I'm Dr. Catalina Castillon, Assistant Director of Undergraduate Research and Director of the Modern Languages Program, and I thank you all for being here tonight because, be ready, this is going to be a superb lecture. It is my great privilege to introduce to you one of my colleagues in the Department of English and Modern Languages, who is also a great supporter of the Lamar University undergraduate research endeavor, Dr. Sara Hillin. Dr. Hillin is one of the best faculty members at Lamar University. She's an outstanding researcher with numerous publications. She is also a remarkable colleague who is always willing to help, as well as a dedicated and active community member and a revered educator. Ever since she joined Lamar faculty in 2006, she became one of the students' favorites. On several occasions, I have overheard them talking about how great her classes are and what a fantastic teacher Dr. Hillin is. So once, I decided to ask a group of her students to pick one of her classes as a favorite. And guess what? They could not come out with just one. They all agreed that all and any of her classes were their favorites. Dr. Hillin is a great teacher and a productive, ingenious, and in-depth scholar who has written fascinating articles on the art of writing and its pedagogy. But as a female academic and a feminist, I am particularly excited about Dr. Hillin's research on rhetoric of female early aviators. When she first told me, and I remember, that she was working on this topic, I became intrigued and excited. All research about women is interesting to me because historically, women have not been given the attention they deserve. Even more, it's interesting if we consider aspects of intersectionality regarding race, class, and gender. Dr. Hillin is about to present to us the guardians of women who were pioneers, as she has also been one. She once told me, and I'm just quoting her, "Just because it has not been done before, or I have not done it before, it does not mean that I cannot try to do it." End of quote. So, in many aspects, like the women pilots in her research, she has been a trendsetter, applying new techniques and methodologies in her classroom. And like the women pilots she's about to present, she's always up to the task. Now, I will not dare to compare 21st century academia with early 20th century aviation, because we have come a long way since then. However, there is still much to do, and I have witnessed Dr. Hillin's work towards a sense of sisterhood that has inspired me and other professors, both male and female. In her original approaches to pedagogy and education as a whole, she's never afraid of innovation. In this sense, she follows into the steps of the subjects of her research. We all nowadays owe a debt of gratitude to those who in the past struggled for equality and tried to make it easier for us. And we should attempt, as Dr. Hillin does, to do the same for generations to come. Now, Dr. Sara Hillin recently mentioned to me that she particularly enjoys working with students conducting research. She told me, and I quote again, that her students astonish her continually with their bright questions and originality, and she's always thrilled when they ask her to be part of their research journeys. End of quote. Now, actually, I believe we should be thrilled because Dr. Hillin is about to take us along on her research journey. So ladies and gentlemen, this evening we're going to learn about flashpoints of flight, the enduring rhetorical legacy of 20th century women aviators. Now be prepared for a treat. By being here this evening, you all hold your boarding passes for a fascinating flight. So please help me welcome the 2017 Distinguished Faculty Lecturer, Dr. Sara Hillin.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Catalina, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here. And I'd like to thank my family, friends, and students and colleagues for coming out tonight. And of course, ExxonMobil for sponsoring this event. So I'll go ahead and get started. What becomes very, very clear with even a little bit of research is that as soon as women involved themselves in aviation at the earliest point, they started writing and speaking about flying in they had very specific persuasive purposes in mind in doing that. However, in 2017, it seems like the media is still very wrapped up in reminding us of Amelia Earhart's accomplishments, and not at all to take away from her achievements, but there are a lot of other women out there, especially in the 20s and 30s, that sort of get overlooked. And I was curious about why that was. Why did those women's voices kind of disappear along the way? And there's an excellent book entitled Women in Rhetoric Between the Wars, and those authors of that book they argue compellingly that an erasure of women's voices, similar to what happened at the close of the Civil War, also happened after World War II, where there was, they say, an increased desire for hearth and home, meaning people became more invested in the whole gender binary and the idea that women really, their roles were more domestic and in the private sphere. I hold, however, that these women's voices are as vitally important as ever, illustrating as they do the power of solidarity in times of technological, social, racial, and political upheaval. Now, I'm going to do what I do in my classes, which is go over some foundational theory just for a couple of minutes so we're all on the same page about what rhetoric is, and then we'll do the fun stuff with the theory, and I'll be applying it to these texts that I've looked at. So there are many definitions of rhetoric I could provide for you, but I think the old standard will kind of work best for our purposes tonight, and for that I turn to a well-known classical figure, Aristotle. Aristotle claimed that rhetoric involves observing in any given case the available means of persuasion, so using what you have to argue, to make a claim, and to try to get your point across to somebody. Lloyd Bitzer tells us that a situation is rhetorical when it creates an opportunity to speak on some urgent matter. He also clarifies that a work of rhetoric is pragmatic. It comes into existence for the sake of something beyond itself. It functions ultimately to produce action in the world or change. It performs some task. And Walter Ong tells us, in an article called The Writer's Audience is Always a Fiction, that any writer has to craft in his or her imagination an audience that's cast in some sort of role. People who have shared your experiences, people seeking entertainment, and so on. But how do we actually judge rhetoric as being effective? Doing that can actually be very difficult. If you've ever given a speech, you may leave thinking you've done a really great job, but you never really tend to know how your audience has responded to it. So that can be very difficult to pin down. But it's my belief, based on evidence culled from their own texts and their target audience's responses to those texts and speeches, that each of the women I discussed tonight was a successful rhetorician in addition to being a very accomplished pilot. The legacy referred to in my title refers to a woman's rhetorical efforts and their effects, either in the short term or long after that rhetoric has been delivered to the public. And there are a couple of other important concepts that have to do with how we now tend to still see their rhetorics, these women of the 20s and 30s. And this has to do with memory. Collective memory is a memory that is not simply an individualized process, but a shared and constructed creation of a group. This type of memory has been instrumental in solidifying Amelia Earhart's seemingly uncontested place as America's first female aviator. In the promo for the recent History Channel documentary about her and the mystery about her disappearance, that's what they called her, America's first female aviator. Public memory, however, is a particular type of collective memory that combines the memories of the dominant culture, but also makes room for fragments of memories of more marginalized groups, and enables the public to make sense of the past, present, and future. Public memory is what allows us to widen our scope and see the efforts of other women, such as Bessie Coleman, an African-American pilot who died in 1926 during a barnstorming exhibition. And it allows us to see her as being no less worthy of celebration. In fact, many people might be very surprised to know that in a prominent newspaper, the 1925 reference to the world's greatest aviatrix was about Coleman and not Earhart. That paper was the Chicago Defender. And of course, power is a great concern in this discussion, especially in relation to this question. How does power, or the lack thereof, affect one's ability to act rhetorically and have agency? As the authors of Rhetoric and Civic Life remind us, class, gender, sex, race, citizenship, political affiliation, education, sexuality, and religion all influence the cultural resources that rhetors, meaning rhetoricians, have access to, and also how much rhetorical power they have. When we think of the rhetoric of a more well-known pilot such as Earhart, many things come to mind. She wrote several books. One was called 20 Hours and 40 Minutes, Our Flight on the Friendship. She has numerous letters, speeches, texts that are out there. They're readily accessible for us, a lot of digitized archives. But private discourses, such as letters, also tell us much about the more hidden history of how women pilots of the first half of the 20th century collaborated to create and maintain a formidable presence in aviation. So the first woman I'm going to be talking about is Harriet Quimby. Harriet Quimby already had a very nicely carved out rhetorical space in the public as a fashion and theater editor for a major publication when she began discussing automobile travel in 1910, and in 1911, the new field of aviation. She wrote for a publication called Frank Leslie's Weekly. It was in circulation from 1855 to 1922, and at the close of, in about 1897, it had a readership of about 65,000 readers. And so, and it continued to grow, and so by the time Quimby was writing, she had a very large audience. And so she started writing about cars in 1910, and then as soon as she got wind of this new development in aviation, this field in its infancy, she became very interested in taking piloting lessons. So from 1911 to 1912, she wrote 10 articles for Leslie's regarding aviation. So she was already a widely read author by the time she began writing those articles. She was the first American woman to hold a pilot's license, and as a woman who already held a prestigious rhetorical platform, she used her clout as a journalist to secure an officially announced position as Frank Leslie's Weekly's expert on aviation, which is noteworthy, especially because Leslie's was a very popular publication. They would publish stories and essays by people like Louisa May Alcott, who was the author of Little Women. So there were many well-known authors that contributed to Leslie's. Having Quimby serve as Leslie's journalistic authority on all things flight-related was really a momentous event, not only for women as aviators, but also for women as writers. As Catherine Adams explains, in the 19th century in America, the man/writer had the cultural role of telling meaningful stories about life and death, man and nature, the struggle to build America, and the role of the individual. Women's professional writing, even up into the 20th century, in the early 20th century, was kind of neatly packaged more into things like gossip columns and columns where they would talk about, mastering your roles in the private sphere, mastering your domestic roles. And also, please keep in mind for historical context that the 19th Amendment, which allowed all American women voting privileges, wouldn't even be ratified until 1920. So Quimby showed an interest in transportation and women's involvement in it even prior to her piloting exploits. So she wrote articles such as Hints to the Man Who Motors Abroad, and another article called Women Automobile Enthusiasts, Where They Learn to Run Their Motors and How They Manage to Master the Mechanical Problems. I had to practice that title a few times. There's a lot of alliteration in there. In that latter article, there's a great quote about the car, but I think later on she would have felt that it applied to flying as well. So in the latter article, she wrote, "The automobile has opened up an almost entirely new world for the woman. The automobile has drawn her out into the open air. The benefit is not only physical, but it's also mental. The mere act of driving a motor car adds exhilaration to the mind." It's with that sentence that I believe we see some of the initial sort of volcanic rumblings in women's writing regarding the powerful potential, not only for the car, but also the airplane, to extract women from their prescribed private and domestic roles. Quimby's detailed accounts of her days as a student pilot were very effective tools for generating people's interest in careers in flight. She was flooded with letters from would-be pilots who saw her as a knowledgeable authority. On May 25, 1911, Quimby stated the following in an article entitled How a Woman Learns to Fly, told by the first woman in the world to manipulate a monoplane. She said, "Here I am, a novice with a fortnight's experience at the Mousson School of Aviation, yet she had 47 letters, 30 of them from women, asking her to learn how to fly. Readers wanted to know, for example, the ins and outs of flight instruction, the cost at various schools, and what job opportunities existed in aviation. Quimby obliged by creating a kind of collaborative give and take. Her narrative of that facet of her life was ongoing and non-linear. It was a sharp contrast from the male-authored travel stories that appeared in Leslie's, which, as Mary Cronin notes, sometimes embellished their author's heroism to a degree that did not square with reality." So Leslie's often would, they would actually send writers, journalists out on adventures. You know, they would try to send them to places where they thought they could, write something very interesting about extreme climates and things like that. And they actually sort of encouraged them to embellish their experiences a little bit to make them stories, high seas adventure type stories and things like that. And so this is just a couple of images of Leslie's weekly, and then there's another shot of Quimby. So moving on just a little bit. And Quimby also talked a lot in her articles about crashes and mishaps, and she would try to figure out how they happened, because she felt very strongly that we shouldn't just continue to feel like, oh, well, it was mysterious, it was, the wind, or it's the weather that caused a crash. She really felt like safety was a huge concern, and they needed to get to the bottom of things like pilot error. What are the misjudgments that people are making in the air? When Quimby became the first woman to cross the English Channel in an airplane in 1912, the editors at Leslie's asked her to write, quote, the thrilling story of this experience. She did write about her experience, but what ended up happening was that she balked at that idea of writing it as a thrilling story. So she prefaces her essay by explaining to her readers her reluctance in making it a story of risk and danger, thus boldly opposing her own publisher's wishes. This is just another shot of her, well, not of her, but of some of the people who fly. So she took a lot of interest in sort of chronicling the lives of other aviators. And this is also the one where they announced officially she was going to have her own column. So I call this one Quimby Resists. And so what she said in her preface was, the editors of Leslie's asked me to write the thrilling story of the crossing of the English Channel on April 16th in a monoplane for the first time by a woman pilot. I'm afraid I shall not be able to make it a thrilling story, although there were some very doubtful moments for me while passing through the heavy banks of fog that rose from the chilly waters. Later on, women pilots such as Earhart would write about aviation and follow suit in discussing their experiences very truthfully without unnecessary embellishment. So we might even say that Quimby's rhetorical savvy and sincerity helped to bring into being the genre of aviation editing. And today, we have people like Lane Wallace, who has a column in Flying Magazine and has for several years. I was asked about Southeast Texas connections, and I really didn't come up with any women for this talk, although there are some. But Gordon Baxter, who is a Port Arthur native, also had an aviation editing column for several decades. So it goes without saying that Amelia Earhart captivated the media's attention. Despite the manner in which her accomplishments have been woven into historical narrative, Earhart was actually a part of something much bigger than just herself, a movement just as rooted in rhetorical strategy as it was in advancing aviation. So she wrote several columns for Hearst Cosmopolitan and in the capacity of aviation editor with the goal of encouraging women to fly. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about that. So that's a cover from Cosmopolitan, from around the time period she was writing for it. So some of her articles were titled Vagabonding by Air, Miss Earhart Answers Some Questions About Flying, Why Are Women Afraid to Fly, and then Try Flying Yourself. And these images I wanted to point out, and this is very common with women pilots from the 20s and 30s, they were often photographed next to their airplanes, and I think that was a very deliberate move. That was a big part of their identities, and so often in a lot of those publicity photos, you see them either in or next to their airplanes. In 1929, a determined group of aviators met in an airplane hangar, women aviators, and they met to organize what would eventually become the 99's Organization of Women Pilots. News of this event was discussed in several publications. So I've got some titles up there, such as American Air Women Organize Club, Women Pilots Organize, and then also Women Flyers Organize. One woman who was kind of at the helm of this movement was Mary Alexander, who also wrote and delivered quite a few speeches and wrote articles. Time really doesn't permit me to talk too much about her, but she was kind of right up there with Earhart in terms of promoting aviation for women. A familiar refrain within Earhart's pieces for Hearst is that we should forge ahead with technological progress despite its dangers, because she says, curiously, the faster we travel, the longer our span of life has become. And in another piece, Why Are Women Afraid to Fly?, she takes on the assumption that women's temperaments might make them less suitable pilots. This is one of my favorite quotes from her. Yeah, so she says, we hear much of women's nerves. They may be different in some ways, but it seems to me that given a similar education, those differences would tend to disappear. A woman can sew, watch 2 or 3 things on the stove, keep an eye on 3 or 4 children, and remain unperturbed. Half an hour in a similar situation for a man completely shatters his nervous system. No doubt many in her audience would have been silently thinking, amen, sister. Rhetorically, a move like that would have helped her build identification with her audience, boosting their belief that piloting was not beyond any woman's reach, and that the specious nerves argument held no weight. Readers were also openly invited to write to Earhart with questions which were answered periodically in her articles. This is just kind of a little nice miscellaneous piece. I found this as I was going through some archives at the 99's Museum. It's a letter from Amelia Earhart to Mary Alexander where she's urging her to remember to send in her ballots. They were having elections for 99's officers, and I just love it because we think of Amelia Earhart, the icon, not really Amelia Earhart, the committee member. So just to see that sort of more mundane side of her work is very interesting. Harriet Quimby was widely lauded as an aviator, as can be seen, and there were poems dedicated to her in Leslie's. But not too many years later, it would be apparent that there were 2 camps when it came to girl flyers, as they were often termed in the media. So I want to give you 2 pretty opposite statements regarding women as pilots to help set the tone for some of the rest of the talk. The first one comes from Frank T. Copeland. Now, he was the managing director of the first women's air races, Air Derby, in 1929. It was also called the Powder Puff Derby, so if you hear that reference, it's the same race. But he writes, no matter how forward and daring and masculine any number of women in any endeavor may become, the general opinion the world over is and likely ever shall be that the feminine is the weaker of the two sexes. He goes on, men and women generally selfishly concede that anything outstanding that a woman can do or does well is something that anyone can do. Okay, and the whole article, what he's kind of trying to argue is that the purpose of that air race was to make flying seem accessible to the general public. There's the idea that, well, if you see women doing, okay, anybody, you know, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense today. But he really was sort of trying to promote the commercial appeal of aviation and did it through that argument, that claim. The second quote comes from a woman identified only as MM, who was writing for the 99's newsletter in 1932. Woman has ceased to accept the valuation that man has placed upon her. She is an individual. She is proving this every day. Witness the unique way that most women fly. No man is going to tell her how to do it. It's an uphill struggle, but she will prove it if she has to fly upside down to do it. No longer is woman merely the childbearer of the race. From now on, man must do his share. Yeah. So please note, excuse me, that those two perspectives take one subject, that of a woman's ability to pilot an aircraft, and infuse it with completely different perspectives. Flying, as pilot Marjorie Brown would later explain, and she was also a journalist and wrote, didn't do so much speaking, but she wrote many, many articles in various magazines about flying and women. So she argued that flying gave women opportunities to showcase their technological skills, but was also changing women by allowing them to form powerful bonds with each other and fulfill unprecedented roles in a new field. Next one I'm going to talk about is Bessie Coleman. Coleman utilized the help of influential editor Robert Abbott of the Chicago Defender to promote flying activities and claim a place in the skies for black pilots. The Defender was established in 1905 by Robert Abbott, and it was an important catalyst for promoting the Great Migration and also had a huge circulation, one of the largest for an African-American newspaper anywhere in the country. And Brian Thornton writes that this was caused in part by its editorial mission espoused by Abbott to destroy American race prejudice. Coleman, an African-American woman born in Atlanta, Texas, scraped together the funds to leave the U.S. for France and later Germany when her attempts to find flight instruction in the U.S. Failed. She could not find anybody at that time who was willing to teach a black woman to fly. Through the Defender, Coleman was able to promulgate the idea of flying as a means for African Americans to involve themselves more heavily in the military and in technological advancements. It's a lot more difficult to find any kind of primary sources from Coleman than it is for, say, Earhart. There was really nobody around filming or transcribing her speeches, so we don't have the same number of extant texts from her. So it's more difficult to locate primary sources for Coleman, but the work in the Defender is a really rich source of text and that can be analyzed, and it's very interesting. So it kind of served as a rhetorical home base for Coleman and Willa Beatrice Brown, who I'll talk about in a minute. Coleman, I believe it can safely be argued, may be the African-American pilot who enjoyed the most obvious and enduring rhetorical success, as she was credited after her death time and time again for being the progenitor of interest in flight for African-Americans. She saw the inclusion of African-American pilots as imperative in keeping up with social and technological progress, stating, and this is her quote, "We must have aviators if we're going to keep pace with the times." She also commented in 1921, after having completed 10 months of training in Europe, that, quote, "I thought it my duty to risk my life to learn aviating and to encourage flying among men and women of the race." She details in that same article her plans to showcase her Newport 130 horsepower aircraft with, she talks about her plans to do those barnstorming and stunt flying exhibitions. The Defender followed Coleman closely from 1921 on, carefully spinning her performances and even her setbacks with thrilling rhetorical finesse. In 1922, the Defender lauded Coleman's initial stunt flying performance, commenting that Coleman was now highly in demand and well-versed in some of the most marvelous flying feats that have ever been performed. When Coleman was in an aircraft accident in 1923, the headline focused on Coleman's continued insistence that flying was safe, and that this incident, furthermore, only proved that aviation was not as dangerous as popular opinion held it to be. And the headline, I realize it's kind of small to read, the headline is, "Bessie Coleman says good will come from hurt." The article reports that, quote, "The fact that she is still living with only a leg broken proves," she says, "that flying in the air is no more dangerous than riding an automobile on the surface." That, in her opinion, should persuade more of her people to take up the art of flying. That Coleman took the reins of this narrative, weaving in a rhetorical element to even a mishap such as a crash, and infusing the incident with persuasive appeal, is a testament to Coleman's brilliance as a rhetorician and the defender's trust in her to portray flying honestly and sincerely. In the 1922 Defender piece entitled "Bessie to Fly Over Gotham," it stated that Coleman, quote, "has been proclaimed by experts at the art of flying in France, Germany, Holland, and Switzerland as the greatest aviatrix in the world, even surpassing the marvelous record made by the famous Ruth Law." Ruth Law had flown nonstop from Chicago to New York in 1916 and was also a spokeswoman for promoting aviation among women. In this piece, Coleman is quoted as reiterating her stance that it's her duty to learn to fly, and also discusses her plans to bring European pilots to America to train other African Americans to learn to fly. Coleman also promoted her image, building a brand, so to speak, through activities such as serving as a business booster for the Coast Tire and Rubber Company. Rhetorically, that move gave her even more credibility and visibility. On April 30th, 1926, Coleman was tragically killed during a practice for a stunt performance. Her mechanic, a white man named William Wills, was with her and perished as well. And the Sunday following her death, the Defender crafted an article focusing on the fact that men, quote, "men, women, and children of all hues came to pay respects to Coleman at the Bethel Baptist Church." The newspaper published a remarkable tribute to Coleman on May 15th of that year. It was entitled "As Americans Should Die," in which the author gave close attention to the significance of the fact that Coleman died alongside Wills. And they say Coleman was, the piece emphasized, quote, "a member of the race generally despised by the race to which Wills belonged." And they saw a lot of significance in the fact that he was a white man. And aviation, of course, is dangerous still, but it was very dangerous in its infancy in the, in the 1920s. And the fact that he made the choice to be with her, he didn't have to, but he took that risk, was very significant, that they died together. So they see some rhetorical significance in that. And it also seems that what would have deeply resonated with readers of The Defender is their assertion that Coleman, quote, "had often been heard to say that she hoped to die in a manner that would react to the benefit of her race and country." In an article written a year after Coleman's death entitled "Bessie Coleman's Spirit Must Live," it's obvious that the enduring legacy of Coleman's rhetoric is being invoked. The author of this piece laments that attempts to gain a foothold in aviation among African Americans were, they say, feeble and disorganized, is the phrasing that they use. And they urge readers to take up the same cause advanced by Coleman, who through performance and speech demanded a rightful place for African Americans to take part in that progress, despite its dangers and the many obstacles to achieving success. So I want to talk a little bit about Willa Beatrice Brown now. She kind of followed in Coleman's footsteps in that she harnessed the editors at The Defender to promote what she was doing in aviation. So just a few facts about Willa Beatrice Brown. In 1937, she earned a commercial pilot's license. She was the first African-American woman to do so in America. She actually trained many pilots and many male pilots who actually went on to become Tuskegee Airmen, and she became the first African-American officer in the U.S. Civil Air Patrol at the rank of lieutenant in 1941. Now I want to talk just a little bit about this piece. It's just titled "Plans Coast to Coast Flight." is from 1938, and this one promoted Brown's plans to not only complete a nonstop flight from New York to California, but also a flight across the Atlantic Ocean. Brown is cited as making sure to connect her ambition with the recent successful flights of Howard Hughes and Douglas G. Corrigan. And as a side note, let's not forget the power of the visual image as a rhetorical tool. If you look at her facial expressions, she's not smiling. I mean, she looks very determined and confident, and she's facing the camera head on. So I think that's just a fascinating image. In the Defender's February 1941 article entitled "Peacetime Flyers," Brown is photographed in a rather bulky flight suit, and the text touts her as the chief personality of aviation in Chicago, talking about her ability to lead her students through months of instruction in aviation theory. The primary rhetorical device through which Brown and Coleman worked was what scholar Shirley Wilson Logan terms racial uplift, a project begun in the 19th century predicated on the belief that through education, economic independence, and sanitary living conditions, African Americans could find success and thrive. Racial uplift is a productive lens through which to view their work because it was decidedly a driving force for both women. Brown's accomplishments are further discussed in the 1940 article, "This Organization Has Made the Sky the Limit for Negro Youth," in which Brown is given credit for being essentially the backbone of the National Airmen's Association. Though she's not directly quoted in this article, the rhetorical implications of her work are indisputable, and this is just one thing from this piece that I think is very significant rhetorically. They say, "At the first suggestion of the organization, she became its secretary, carrying on an exhaustive correspondence, whipping into workable form the many ideas and suggestions made as to the purpose and program of the organization, working indefatigably to enlist members and create interest where there was none." Therefore, Brown was very pragmatic, drawing an audience out of its complacency and into a new era in which they were vitally involved in aviation. Connected with this work to create interest, Brown, who's described as a legend among those interested in flying, visited college campuses, and she did speeches at various colleges, and Howard University was one of them, to drum up enthusiasm for flight among the students. And she would also do flight demonstrations and answer students' questions on these visits. In February 1941, Brown became president of the Chicago National Airmen's Association chapter, and then in August 1941, she delivered a radio address entitled "The Negro in Aviation," which focused on the history of African Americans in flight. She actually, and just one interesting last note about Brown, is that her accomplishments didn't really stop there. She went on to be the first African-American woman to run for Congress in 1946. But Brown's rhetorical efforts of the late 1930s and early 1940s are very salient because they were so remarkably successful. Her credibility was redoubtable, and she knew how to harness her resources and mobilize groups of students who would themselves become successful pilots. The next woman I'd like to talk about is Thea Rasche. She was a German pilot. She was Germany's first aerobatic woman pilot. And this is also kind of the story of Glenn Buffington. I'm going to kind of weave that in there as well. And the scene of Rasche's early career, which is Nazi Germany, is of great importance and tells us a lot about her attempt to tell not only her story, but the stories of the early pioneers in aviation from the US and Australia. So I want to talk just a little bit about this correspondence. This is where I'm drawing most of my information about Rasche from her own words in these letters. Glenn Buffington is really not very well known in aviation history, but I kind of think he should be. He left boxes of his correspondence, letters from him and letters that he got from many well-known women aviators over decades, from probably the mid to late 20th century. And he's just a guy who was interested in their experiences, and he started writing to them, and so he got several really interesting long-term correspondences going with these women, and Thea Rasche was one of those. So after they kind of start corresponding a little bit, Rasche starts writing him letters where she's giving very detailed accounts of her life and the struggle that she kind of went through in trying to publish her works. Now, she had written, in the 1920s, Rasche had written several books about the early American women aviation pioneers. And she said that about 5,000 volumes sold very quickly. Well, not too long after that, during the Nazi era, there was censorship, and so those books were censored, and she was not allowed to publish any more of those. And she says in her letters that the reason that she was given was that she spoke too highly of our enemies, meaning the Americans. So Rasche and Buffington were kind of collaborators in women's aviation history. And this is just a picture of a couple of letters where she's telling him that maybe he could write an article about Marvel Crossan, who had died during the Powder Puff Derby. And so they kind of correspond about what they know about some of the early aviators. So Buffington proved a sounding board for Rasche's drive to tell her own story as well as that of other women. One can see through the several years of their correspondence how a truly moving friendship develops, with Buffington being both curious about Rasche's adventurous life, but also being very respectful about the areas which she clearly felt shame and regret about. So, for example, she had been in some air shows with a man named Ernst Udet, who was, I think, maybe the second highest ranking flying ace in Germany at the time. But the more she got to know him, the more she realized he was kind of shady. I mean, to put it mildly, there's a lot of detail in her letters about that. So she had written several books about the early pilots in America, and she laments in one letter to Buffington how her ability to spread that knowledge and also highlight flight as a means of forging alliances was curtailed by the Third Reich. And just one quote I want to give you from her. She says, "Too bad I can't now send you my book about the pioneer times. I still try to find a publisher for it. The Nazis forbid it. 5,000 were sold very quick, and then I did not get the permission to print it further because I had spoken too nice of our American enemies. And I also praised international friendship between all flyers of the world. And so they just forbid it because I spoke highly of American and Australian discoverers. What a funny world. And still, there are some who are trying all to make it so that my books cannot appear." Rasche's discussion gives a chilling reminder of the tactics used during Nazi-era Germany to preclude the social construction of knowledge, but also to acknowledge flying as a means of developing beneficial international friendships. Rasche did, however, go on to publish articles in her native Germany about some of the American pioneers, and Buffington kind of took what he could from her. She kind of nudges him to write some articles to be published in American journals. So this is a letter where she discusses that censorship, where she's talking to Buffington about that experience. And one of the sort of moving things that happens in their correspondence is where Buffington writes her asking permission to write a biographical sketch on her. And this is a letter where he's asking her, I just want to write a little short piece on you. Can you give me some information about your planes, any interesting races or experiences that you experienced during your career. And what I love is that she wrote back with a 5-page single-space typed letter. So clearly she was ready to work through his influence to harness his credibility to advocate for the telling of her own tale, which had been distorted and kind of swept under the rug. Her, after she kind of separated herself from Udet and all of some of the nasty stuff that was going on in her early career, she could not, her career as an aviation editor was pretty much ruined for decades. So Rasche was positively thrilled to have an ally in a position to pick up where she left off, and she also nudges him to write about the forgotten pilots. And this is what resulted from his request for some biographical information on Rasche. This is the article that appeared in the 1966 American Aviation Historical Journal about Rasche. So it's taking everything that she told him about her experiences and some photographs that she had sent him. And the final woman that I want to talk about is Jerry Cobb. The crucial rhetorical work done by women aviators between 1911 and the late 1930s provided a momentum for the women who would follow in the decades to come, particularly during the early days of the space age. Pilot Jerry Cobb has the distinction of possibly being the American woman most eminently qualified to go into space who was never actually allowed to do so. Cobb's accomplishments as an aviator alone are noteworthy. She set records for speed, among other things, taking 2 records from Russian male pilots. But what earns her mention in this lecture is her relentless and ultimately successful rhetorical activism and advocacy for future American women astronauts. Cobb was one of a small group of women, including Wally Funk, Jerry Truehill, and Rhea Hurl, who campaigned to have women included in the space program. Now, several books have been written about that time. There's one called Right Stuff, Wrong Sex, and this quote is from a woman named Marie Lathers, who wrote a really good article about it, but she says that the history of women in the U.S. space program has a clear beginning, although its origins can be characterized as a false start. The unofficial and aborted program of the Mercury 13. Cobb was the most outspoken of the 13, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. She was the one who really campaigned aggressively to not only, she hoped that she would be able to go into space, but as it became clear that she was not going to realize that dream, she wanted to kind of expose the sexism that was happening, that was preventing women from being able to participate. In 1961, Life magazine lauded Cobb's accomplishments, giving a nod to their rhetorical implications. And they say, Jerry Cobb of Oklahoma City, who has proved that women are as capable as men of enduring the rigors of spaceflight, is the first prospective space pilot in a hitherto unannounced 12-women program being sponsored and conducted by the Lovelace, founded in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is also referred to as the Lovelace program. It was not officially sanctioned by NASA, but they were having these women go through the exact same testing that the Mercury 7 went through. And the results actually showed that Cobb and a couple of the other women, they exceeded the expectations. They did just as well as the Mercury 7 pilots did in these tests. And so in 1959, and kind of in the middle of the Cold War era, Cobb passed every grueling test to qualify for a space mission. But she was never able to realize that dream, as her efforts took place during a time in which the idea of a woman astronaut was met at every turn within government organizations with, not maybe every turn, but there was a lot of disdain and just kind of perplexity about it. Her mental and physical capabilities were irrefutable, but she was denied the opportunity based on some illegitimate arguments. And this slide, I've just got some headlines from the era in which she was doing this testing. Here's the first one. Pretty pilot prepares for space. And in a lot of these articles, a lot of them, it'll start with something like, pretty ponytailed Jerry Cobb hopes to be the first American woman in space, or a blonde woman wants to become the first woman in space. So they tended to focus on those physical details sometimes in a way that seems kind of inappropriate, but it's a very common thing to see from those news stories from that time about her. Journalists seem more content to worry themselves over what to call this new breed of pilot woman, and they were literally arguing about this. Like, we cannot call them astronauts. Maybe we should call them astronets. There are several articles that are devoted to that. Still, Cobb's rhetorical power lay in her outspoken stance on sexism as a pervasive issue within aviation. In 1962, she gave an address to the first International Women's Space Symposium in Los Angeles, which caught the attention of House Representative Ken Heckler and compelled him to concede in remarks entitled, "Women Can Be Astronauts," the following: "I believe we should give serious consideration to the inclusion of women among our future astronauts." He also says, "I also believe that the arguments have been well stated by Jerry Cobb." In her speech, Cobb relies on hard evidence as opposed to emotional appeals, just pathos. She talks about the actual test results to support her claim that women do, in fact, belong in space exploration. And she says, out of this group, 12 have passed the same physical, laboratory, X-ray, and physical competence tests given the Mercury astronauts. The results have proven the fact that women are physically and emotionally capable of withstanding the stresses of spaceflight. Cobb was also outspoken about her position versus that of the first Soviet woman to enter space, who's Valentina Tereshkova in 1963. In the October 1963 article that was entitled, "She's Ready for Space, but NASA Says No," Neil Yenner writes that Cobb's, quote, quick, dimpled smile flashes in lighthearted banter about her failure to beat Valentina. Immediately following that, Yenner offers the following quote from Cobb, and she says, quote, "Let's face it, women don't have equal rights in the United States. There's an attitude that women shouldn't compete with men." Later in that same piece, Cobb is quoted as saying, "The Soviets are utilizing their women. They give equal rights to women." There's a gravity in Cobb's words that the label of lighthearted banter cannot efface, and yet it seems obvious that most writers preferred to gloss over Cobb's valid indictments and exposure of the perpetual failure to consider her and other women as serious candidates for the space program. Cobb enacted a rhetoric of patience for a while, talking about her hopes of becoming the first American woman in space, but eventually she adamantly admitted that she was nearing the end of her patience. And this is a quote from her. She says, "They told me to be patient, but after 3 years, I'm running out of patience." And this is the Heckler piece, the Congressional Record, where he actually quotes her speech in its entirety. That Cobb made her disappointment, vulnerability, and frustration known to the public is significant because it illustrates her willingness to use that vulnerability as a flashpoint to take the conversation on women in space into a necessary direction that would serve the women who came after her, such as Sally Ride. As her own goal drifted further and further out of reach, she used her available means of persuasion to raise awareness about women's suitability as astronauts. And this is just a picture of Cobb. She's third from the left. This was taken in 1995 at the Kennedy Space Center. There's a direct line from these women's rhetorical efforts to today's women in aviation who use rhetorical strategies to continue to spark women's interest in the field. Jeanette Epps, who is now a NASA astronaut and aerospace engineer, and she's scheduled to go on her first mission in 2018, has given numerous interviews and lectures regarding her profession. In March 2017, several of the Whirly Girls, a noted group of women helicopter pilots founded in 1955 by Jean Ross Howard Phelan, touched down in Dallas, Texas, with the purpose of encouraging girls to consider careers in piloting. The Bessie Coleman Aerospace legacy also continues Coleman's mission of, quote, encouraging minorities to enter the field of aviation. The organization Women in Aviation International has numerous chapters, including one in Houston, Texas, and the publication Aviation for Women provides a visible platform for women in all fields of aviation. And of course, the 99's Organization of Women Pilots is still thriving in its home base in Oklahoma City, where they have the museum, providing both a physical archive of materials and also making the stories of the early pilots available digitally through their website. In closing, I'd like to mention a comment from cultural theorist Helene Cixous' Laugh of the Medusa. It's a passage that I feel is appropriate because although Cixous' intention is a bit more metaphorical, I believe it applies both metaphorically and literally in this context. She writes, "Flying is woman's gesture, flying in language and making it fly. We have all learned the art of flying and its numerous techniques. What woman hasn't flown, stolen? Who hasn't felt, dreamt, performed the gesture that jams sociality? Who hasn't crumbled, held up to ridicule the bar of separation? From Harriet Quimby to today's pilots, there's a legacy of rhetorical savvy, tireless collaboration, and a continued discursive effort to forge new paths in aviation and open doors to crumble the bar of separation for those who have been marginalized. This legacy is etched in writing and speech, both public and private, but powerful and effective no matter its origins." Thank you.
Sarah, thank you for that wonderful voyage and a very safe landing. It's my pleasure again to invite Dr. Evans to the podium.
Sarah, exceptional job. When you think of the context of aviation, it's such a great equalizer. And it makes the opportunity for rhetoric and so many barriers to be broken down. Fascinating. Thank you. By the way, I haven't heard of Gordon Baxter's name mentioned in the same context as embedded rigor of fact. But nonetheless, thank you. That said, we have a plaque for you, commemoration of your distinguished lecture. The Faculty Senate of Lamar University and ExxonMobil honor Dr. Sara Hillin, Associate Professor of English, as the 14th Distinguished Faculty Lecturer, October 3rd, 2017. Sir? Thank you all for joining us this evening.
You need to invite Ashley, Exxon, and give them the...
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Don't leave yet, please. This is what happens. Ashley, would you come forward? She has something that's far more important than the plaque, I believe. My goodness gracious, I forgot entirely about it. Thank you. Do you have it here with you? No. We're going to pretend that we gave it to her. And we'll do that later. It's in the mail. Thank you.
Olive, come in nice and close.